So in this video, I'm going to talk to you about Amends by Adrienne. This is probably one of my favourite poems from the collection, if you're doing the CIE collection. And it's quite interesting. It's just full of ideas about humans and nature and how we interact with the environment. If you ever get stuck with a poem, it's good to start with the themes and kind of work backwards from there. So what does it make us think? And then how is that reflected in the poem? So yeah, if you kind of put your environmental hat on, that might help you understand this poem. I can't reproduce the whole thing because of copyright. So if you feel like you want to refresh the poem, definitely pause me before we start and just read through that now. And then when you're ready, we're going to jump into the analysis. So vocab first, a couple of words here. Unavailing means you're trying, but it's not working. So all your efforts are not going in the right place. Hangared just means to do with a hangar, so a shelter where planes are kept. Fuselage, the main body of an aircraft. The actual phrase to make amends, which is both the title and present in the poem itself, means to fix something, basically, usually with arguments or a falling out, some kind of situation that's gone wrong. You might make amends to make up for the wrongdoing or the problem. Tremulous kind of sounds like what it is. Trembling, shaking, quivering. My voice is a bit tremulous there. Crop dusting plane is a type of plane. I looked it up and it was quite difficult to figure out this one, but it's basically a small yellow plane, it seems like, that is a farming plane. So it's used for fertilizer, to spread fertilizer over fields by farmers. So it's not the kind of plane that you go on holiday with or anything like that. It's like a small kind of farming plane. And finally, trailers, which if you're American, you know what these are anyway, but for anyone who's not American, they're a kind of metal cabin where people hang out or sleep or cook, sometimes live, sometimes camp. They can also be permanent dwelling places. So a little bit like a caravan, if you're used to caravans in England. Wherever your country of origin is, you probably have something similar to a trailer there. So now we're done with the vocab. We'll have a look at the story. So sometimes I do story stanza by stanza or kind of section by section. Sometimes if it feels quite fluid, as this poem does, it makes more sense to do the story in a chunk. So we're going to have a look at it in a chunk together. So it's set at night and it's a natural environment. And we have a look at, the first thing that we sort of look at in the poem is an apple tree. Light explodes out of the bark of the tree. So each piece of light is described as a white star. And we realize that it's kind of moonlight that's hitting the tree that's sort of reflecting off it, and it looks like white stars on the tree. We realize that the moonlight is kind of picking up a kind of, I don't know what the word is, it's like as it moves over the landscape, it's illuminating or highlighting certain features of that landscape, and that's what the poet draws our attention to. So it's picking at stones, meaning it's highlighting those stones. It's picking up the details on the white surf of the sea. It's licking broken ledges, so broken rock formations. Flowing up cliffs, which is quite a hard phrase to say, actually, I just realized. Flowing up cliffs and flickering across tracks. Here we go. In the third stanza, it continues, but it shifts focus. So it's gone across all of these natural elements and it shifts to man-made elements. The plane, the crop dusting plane that is resting in the hangar. These are made by humans. The quarry, which is something that is an example of humans mining the landscape for our own use. Finally, the light goes into the trailers, and we assume that there are people in the trailers, so they're shaking with sleep, and it rests on the eyes of the people who are asleep there. So it kind of bathes the sleepers in the trailers in moonlight. And the poet uses a simile, and she says, as if to make amends. So it feels like this moonlight is really powerful, and it's traveling over the landscape, and it's trying to fix something that has gone wrong, maybe something that's gone wrong between humans and nature. So feel free to pause and kind of read through that again if you're stuck or if some of it didn't make sense to you or you want to kind of cross-reference across the poem. But if you're ready, we're going to move on to a little bit of the more detailed analysis now. So firstly, with some form and structure ideas, we have this shift in perspective between natural order or natural sort of features of the landscape, the apple trees, cliffs, sea, and then to human features, trailers, aeroplane, quarry. We call this a volta. So when there's a turning point in the poem and suddenly either we change perspective or the focus shifts quite clearly, this is the term for that is a volta. It's a really good form point to get into essays. So make sure you're good at identifying and using voltas. So basically there's a clear separation from nature and human-made elements, but the moon and the moonlight bathe over everything, we realise. It's one single sentence, which is one reason why I didn't want to split up the summary of it. So it's a single continuous feeling, and it feels like the moonlight is flowing from one thing to another through the stanzas and through the lines. So as the moonlight travels and illuminates, it's kind of flowing as one continuous movement. And that's why I feel the poet has chosen to render that as a single sentence. It also means that you kind of don't really pause as you're reading the poem. So if you've read it aloud, which you should at some point, you probably noticed that you're not kind of really stopping until the very final word. It makes it feel like a lot of lines hang in space then without a conclusion, just up to this bit here. Because it feels as though there's kind of no ending or beginning to this moonlight. It's sort of running and flowing in the way that the lines flow themselves. I'm not going to go through all of these techniques because, just to save your poor ears from having to hear too much. But feel free to pick up on some of the other ones as well here. I'll just pick up on maybe two more that I feel really are quite significant and explore those with you. So one thing you'll notice if you read the poem is it says "as it" a lot. We call this anaphora because it's repeating the beginning of a sentence. So it is a kind of repetition, but anaphora is a better word for it. It's more kind of precise, really. So it creates a kind of rhythm or a flow as it does this and as it does that. So it creates this kind of continuity, but also this refreshing feeling of a new image or a new feature that's being described. It's also quite a persuasive technique, anaphora. So maybe she's building a persuasive argument. We call it a rhetorical device. So it's used in speeches and persuasive writing quite a lot. So maybe she's kind of using the anaphora to show the unrelenting, continuous nature of moonlight, which I feel represents kind of a force of the world. Maybe she's using it to sort of persuade us of her opinion about humans and nature and how we interact and affect each other. This thing also really struck me, the lack of punctuation. It's quite interesting because poems normally use quite a lot of punctuation to create a variety to the rhythm and the pace of the way that we read them. But there's very little punctuation, which again creates a sense of continuity and a kind of regular flow to the poem in a sort of objective, almost non-judgmental way. Like this moonlight is very neutral and it spreads across the land in a very even way, and it kind of goes at a steady pace. It doesn't change at any point. So it's this very sort of purifying and I don't know what the word is, like I'm getting stuck with my words today, but kind of like an eternal or kind of powerful but also very passive, peaceful force. So there's this sense of a continuous, unaffected flow of moonlight, which is because the punctuation is not there or it's not really very varied. it stops you from varying the way that you read it. You kind of read it in the same sort of tone, same sort of speed the whole way through. So hopefully that makes sense to you. So a couple of language points then. It is quite interesting. She uses the third person singular pronoun, it. So quite often, moons are portrayed as goddesses in mythology. I think a lot of people think of moons as feminine. I'm not quite sure why. I think it's just a tradition in the stories if you read them. But in this case, Adrienne Rich calls it it. She just calls the moonlight it. So it's not a masculine or feminine force. And I think this is deliberate because you have this idea of the fact that it's non-gendered. So it's very, again, neutral and unbiased, or it doesn't have any human qualities because it's a natural kind of eternal thing. So it makes it feel less human, dehumanizes the moonlight. So even though the moonlight is a powerful force, it's not personified. It's deliberately not given a masculine or feminine character, which I find quite an interesting point to go into detail with. There's some rhyming words here, which are quite nice. Picks, licks, flicks. You probably notice those as you read. We call those full rhyme because they're a complete rhyme. Each syllable rhymes fully and they're all monosyllabic as well. We have a really interesting image that I touched upon earlier of this sand and gravel quarry. So it's sort of negative, I feel, when this comes up in the poem, because there's this kind of negative atmosphere around the sense that there should be rock there still, which has taken the earth, thousands of years of pressure and so on to build up and make. It takes a long time to make rock. I used to be quite into geology, so so that's where I get my ideas from. But yeah, whatever kind of rock it is, it would have taken a very long time to make, and we just, in a generation or across a few years, we need that material, so we just mine it, and then when we finish mining it, we just abandon that part of the landscape that we've destroyed. So it's a feeling that humans destroy the land to mine resources. Maybe that we have a bit of a selfish and brutal relationship with nature. You might connect that to modern ideas to do with fear of climate change and environmentalism, worrying about our carbon footprint and how much of an impact an individual human can have on kind of damaging the ecosystems and the imbalance of the planet. So I feel like it's very environmental and ecological, this poem, in a lot of ways. But something that's really positive about it, rather than being fixated on the negativity, is that, again, this moonlight that is pervasive, it's everywhere in the poem, is actually pouring into all of these kind of broken aspects of the landscape and replenishing it, filling it in a kind of purifying and neutralizing way. So the light is now pouring, unavailing, meaning it's kind of like trying to repair it. It's sort of going, unavailing is a continuous movement as well. So there's a gash which suggests violence, like we've done violence upon the landscape, and the light is sort of trying to repair that. So she's suggesting, I think, that it's a blemish, it's a mark, it's something unsightly on the landscape, this gash, and that the moonlight is sort of representing the natural forces of nature, and it's trying to refill or heal or replenish that broken part of the land. The final language point I'm going to just pick up on is a general language point, so you can use this about any of the images or pieces of the poem that you feel apply to this. But I feel like it's kind of metaphorical in a lot of ways, so the sense of metaphor is really strong here. So the way that humans have physically damaged the land also suggests that we're also kind of spiritually broken in a way ourselves, that we are somehow at odds with nature, even though we're from nature. We're supposed to work in harmony with it, but we actually take too much and we kind of brutally damage the landscape around us. So it feels like we're spiritually, in a way, I think this is what Riche is trying to say anyway, that we're spiritually broken. We're kind of, again, at odds with nature rather than working harmoniously with it. But instead of it being a force of kind of anger or stress, we have this sense that the moonlight is repairing, that it's got this kind of like healing, purifying force behind it, that it's trying to kind of make up for that spiritual brokenness in humans themselves as much as it is in nature itself. So a couple of context points now. Not all of these are going to be useful in an essay, so feel free to write down the ones that you think are kind of helpful or useful that you can maybe use rather than all of them. But yeah, I kind of just gave you quite a lot of context on this one. What's quite interesting, I think, if I pick up a few of them that I think are quite significant, maybe. A lot of her poems are kind of lyrical and sensual. They focus on thoughts and emotions, which does kind of link to this idea of her being a feminist or just her being a woman. As I said, it's quite interesting because the moon is associated with femininity, but then she rejects that as well and calls it it. So she kind of tries to neutralize that association. But I feel like it's quite a feminine poem. It's very in tune with emotions, and it's very kind of it flows in like this kind of feminine way. So when you look at feminine writing, which is not always written by women, so James Joyce, a male writer, wrote this thing called écriture féminine. So it's not particularly gendered in terms of who actually, whether males or females write this way, but in terms of the type of writing that we're looking at, it's kind of feminine writing, meaning it's not logical, it's not rigid, it's kind of flowing, and it's full of soft movements and transitions from one state to another, which are associated with, I'll just write kind of écriture féminine in here. Feel free to look more into that type of writing if you think it's a useful point to use. Another idea that's quite interesting is this one. So when she was younger and she wrote, Adrienne Riche is quite interesting because she sort of tried to just have a very typical life that was expected of a woman in her times to start with, and it wasn't really enough for her. Like, she didn't feel fulfilled. So she became more political later on in life, which is usually the other way around. People tend to be more political when they're younger and they kind of calm down when they're older. So she sort of did the opposite, where she felt like she'd missed out on some aspect of living by the life that she chose, which was a very stable kind of normal life at the time, getting married very early, having children and so on. So she became more radical and confrontational as she got older. And this poem's actually written quite late on in life. I think in the 90s, the poem was written. So she's quite a lot kind of more formed in her later self and the more radical or confrontational self. So she's exploring more difficult ideas, I suppose, or kind of more things that are sort of more unusual, really, and more challenging. So just to finish up then, I'm going to give you a few themes to think about, maybe some questions to think about as well. So feel free to go explore these further. It's always good once you've learned a lot about a poem to then go back and figure out your own opinion and your own interpretation. So don't just take what I say and what I interpret as standard. Go and explore for yourself. So there's some kind of key themes that I've outlined here. More exploration of those will help you when you come to write essays, because typically the essay questions too, as you see here, are going to be on those themes.